For more on these developments, we're joined by James Gooderson, Asia One correspondent live from Washington, D.C. Hello, James. So Hamas has agreed to disarm, which can be a significant breakthrough maybe in Donald Trump's peace initiative. But what are the obstacles that can hamper achieving a lasting peace in the Middle East?
Yeah, there's a lot going on for President Trump in the Middle East, isn't there? Let's start with this breakthrough, as it's being hailed, when it's to Gaza. It is very significant, this announcement, which came near the end of last night here in Washington, D.C. The idea of Hamas disarmament was a crucial aspect in President Trump's 15-point plan. Now that domino appears to have fallen. It opens up the way for some serious change in the Middle East, because this agreement was perhaps the most significant obstacle in the peace plan, and this announcement could lead to further things happening, such as a technocratic government overseeing Gaza for the foreseeable, the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Strip, and indeed the reconstruction of Gaza and a pathway to statehood. All of those things were included on President Trump's initial 20-point plan. But a word of caution here for several reasons. Firstly, we haven't had any official statements from Israel about this. From Hamas's point of view, some sources have commented saying they won't disarm until Israel withdraw. But before this announcement even happened, Israeli officials said, we're not going to withdraw until Hamas disarm. So that needs to be sorted out. Hamas also wants to store their weapons under a Palestinian authority rather than hand them over to anybody else. And finally, they've said that heavy weapons would be given up, which implies that they don't necessarily want to hand over things like guns and grenades, but would hand over, for example, the remaining missiles that they have. So a lot of knots for not only President Trump, but also his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as well as the US Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. A lot for them to untangle. They have said in the past, if Hamas break this deal, then Israel can take military action again. A US official also said last night that if Israel doesn't agree to this, then President Trump will be, quote, disappointed. So what happens next? Well, at this point, we have got the text of the new 15-point plan that says that Israel and Gaza representatives have 2 weeks to determine a schedule on when those weapons could be given up. Donald Trump has been bullish about diplomatic breakthroughs before, only for them to peter out in other theatres of war. But if this does hold up, it could mark a significant breakthrough by the president in the Middle East, which could redefine the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian people.
So, James, President Donald Trump has met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington, but in their public statements, we have seen that Gaza was not didn't have the attention that the war in Iran is gaining in the United States. Now, do you think that maybe the situation in Gaza is not a priority for the U.S. administration for now, and maybe their focus is only on the war on Iran?
Well, yes, indeed. Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump met at the White House on Tuesday, and they certainly had a lot to talk about, didn't they? We didn't get a readout from the meeting. All we got was the White House press statement saying it was very positive, and Benjamin Netanyahu himself saying it was one of the best conversations he's ever had with President Trump. But of course, it's not just those two men in a room together. They will have been joined by a huge number of officials and aides. So you imagine, no doubt, that Gaza did come up, and perhaps the two leaders themselves instead focused directly on Iran, because these discussions about Hamas and Israel and the Strip have been going on in the background for quite a while. So that likely rumbled on between different officials. I think in reality, Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump would have been talking more about Iran. And of course, it is notable that in the 48 hours since that meeting, we've seen changes in both theatres of conflict that those two countries are embroiled in. And remember, of course, that both men are facing critical elections in a few months' time. Benjamin Netanyahu up for re-election in October, and then President Trump has to face his second midterms in early November. So neither of them would want a particular fallout from this meeting. They wouldn't look like they want to disagree. President Trump is very popular in Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu will be banking on the president's support in order to give him some points in the polls for that election. And then from President Trump's point of view, he needs to work closely with the Israeli Prime Minister to find a solution in Iran in order to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz crisis doesn't bite too much back home. But of course, if that Iran conflict delivers, it could drown out all of the success that possibly seems to have come from this Hamas breakthrough.
So now, James, turning to the situation on the ground, Tehran claims it has launched drone attacks targeting U.S. military assets in Kuwait. What is the latest from Washington about these claims, and how is Washington responding to these attacks?
Yes, you're right. They were aimed at US bases in Kuwait, just over the Persian Gulf. A US Defense Department official told the New York Times that those strikes did happen, but said there hadn't been a major impact on US bases in the region. And, you know, just looking at literally just this week, we have Iran's attacks on Kuwait, like we just said. They say that's in response to recent US strikes where they hit at military command centres and missile and drone factories. And the US said that those strikes were in response to Iran firing ballistic missiles. That's all happened since Monday. It does feel like we are back to a tit-for-tat exchange, despite there being a sense at the start of this week in the morning in Washington, D.C., that the president was going to sort of pause strikes for the moment for two reasons. Number one, to sort of pivot a bit again towards diplomacy. But number two, and this is what has been not said publicly, but has been briefed to various US media outlets, that actually the US munitions stockpile has run dangerously low. And that's not just offensive missiles, but also interceptors to stop Iran's missile attacks themselves. So there was a sense that the US were going to pump the brakes on any sort of firing, but that hasn't happened. Instead, they've renewed their attacks, and Iran has as well. Other allies in the Middle East of the US, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, they've faced attacks. But I think what's most notable from the recommencement of these strikes this week is the fact for the first time in this conflict, a strike has occurred in Egypt. It's not clear who fired the drone that hit a port, but there is concern that this war, not only is it possibly beginning again in earnest, but also that the conflict in the Middle East could be spreading and indeed could disrupt further global trade. Of course, Egypt have stewardship over the Suez Canal. That's another key, possibly the most key, choke point for global trade, more so than the Strait of Hormuz. It allows ships to cross into the Mediterranean rather than going all the way round Africa. So concerns as well in the Red Sea, where the Houthis in Yemen have been targeting vessels. That's an Iranian-backed armed group too. So there's a lot of concern, firstly about, okay, well, is the war spreading once more? And secondly, where does this leave us? We seem a long, long way away from that memorandum of understanding that was signed a few months ago.
So, James, finally, President Trump is hosting a cabinet meeting at Camp David. What key messages has emerged from those discussions? And how is the president positioning himself now politically ahead of the crucial midterm elections in November?
Yes, so it's actually very rare for the president to hold a cabinet at Camp David. That is a sort of countryside retreat where the president can go, have more sort of secret and intimate conversations with world leaders or indeed his own political staff, come out of the heat of Washington as well. It's very rare for a cabinet meeting to go there, so that's just worth remarking on in the first place. The president spoke some words at the cabinet meeting to the media that were there, mentioned a variety of different topics that we'll get into. But firstly, on Iran, he said it was doing very poorly. He called Iran dishonest and dishonorable to deal with, which isn't a particularly great sign that negotiations are going well. He said that their manufacturing capacity was almost gone, that their drone capacity was almost gone, that the US was doing an amazing job. And then on your question about the midterms, midterms, this is very interesting because it's no secret that the war in Iran is quite unpopular now in the US. President Trump initially said it would take 4 to 5 weeks to get it done. Well, we're now into the 6th month of this conflict since it began. And I think President Trump tried to note that in his speech at the start. He said, well, look, we've been there it's a much bigger job than initially anticipated. But if you look at other wars, he pointed towards Vietnam, he pointed towards Afghanistan. He said the United States have been in there for years. So really, 5 months isn't that long at all. And then he finished off by saying, and we have obliterated them. So that seems to be his line when it comes to the midterms, that yes, it's taking a bit longer than I thought, but if you compare it to other conflicts that the US has been in, it's actually not that long at all. He trumpeted his tariff policy as well, saying it was making America rich and successful. And then finally, an attack on the opposition party, the Democrats. He was saying that the US would face a migrant crisis if the Democrats win. Now, of course, immigration, a real hot topic issue in the US, and President Trump keen to seize that ahead of the midterms. And just a note on where he is politically, President Trump isn't seen by the US public as doing a particularly great job in his second term. His approval ratings aren't great. And if you'd asked me this question sort of 6 months ago, I would say he would be looking very close at losing not only the House of Representatives, but also the Senate in these midterms. Now it looks like the game has slightly changed. The House of Representatives, I think it'd be very difficult for the Republicans to hold on to their majority there. But the Senate looks more in play for the Republicans.
Thank you so much, James, for bringing us the latest from Washington, D.C.